We were like a week or two away from starting the company. It was kind of crazy timing. Like we were leaving our jobs to go focus on this 100% full time. Right when this thing came out, the product barely existed. Like it was just like some cobbled together thing that we had as like a demo.
Thousands of companies show up to sell their technology to the US Department of Defense each year. But so few will transition from proof of concept to true production across the valley of death. The select few who do, their stories are rarely told. Until now. I'm Noah Scheinbaum, and this is Crossing the Valley. Jesse Kallman is the founder and CEO of Danti, a startup building a search engine for Earth observation data. Danti makes it easy to search across vast quantities of information captured from places like satellites, ships, social media, and more to answer specific analytic questions. Jesse's got a broad background. He's had a long history with drones. He's been a trusted advisor to executives of Fortune 500 companies, to members of Congress, and even the White House. And he's worked at many large defense primes, including Airbus, Booz Allen Hamilton, and Northrop Grumman. Over the 3 years since Danti started, the company's won significant contracts with government agencies such as NGA and the Space Force. We caught up with Jesse just ahead of the company's public sector platform launch to talk about Danti's path to production and the future of multi-INT analysis. All right, everybody. I am joined today by Jesse Kallman, the CEO and founder of Danti. Jesse, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, why don't we start with a bit of an overview of what Danti is and why this is the company that has captured your attention, your time, and your energy at this stage of life.
Sure. Well, yeah. So thanks again for having me. So just to talk a little bit about what the company is and what our mission is and what we're doing. So we founded Danti a little over 2 years ago to go after this problem of there's just so much information being generated around the planet every day, from space, from air, from the ground, from the news, social media, and analysts across the US government generating analysis. People are generating analysis of properties. Just so many different use cases of information being generated, but the amount of people out there that deeply understand these types of information, the modalities, how to use it, what kinds of questions they can answer is not growing at anywhere near the same rate. So with everything we were seeing in sort of the knowledge graph and language models and NLP space and all these different technologies that were advancing, we felt like it was finally time where we could build and encode in software a knowledge engine that truly understood what all these types of information meant, who they were impactful for, the kinds of questions you could answer with them, and make it so that someone of any skill, right, either a 15-year expert analyst in the intelligence community or a service member deployed overseas who just needs information quickly for a given topic, can interact with a huge distributed set of information that is multimodal and distributed across the government or commercial world and get to what they need fast. And so that's really what we've been trying to focus on is how can we encode a lot of this tradecraft and domain knowledge that's kind of in our heads and a lot of the heads of the experts out there, but to really help the non-experts, help the experts get to what they need really, really fast, but really remove that bottleneck between the experts and the non-experts so that they can have software that understands signals or SIGINT flows, GeoINT flows, how to, sift through 10 million bits and of open source information. So that's really at the heart of why we wanted to do this.
Yeah, it's certainly a laudable mission. And I mean, you're clearly a guy who's been deeply enmeshed in this industry for some time. I mean, you've done tours at many of the major defense primes and leading industry organizations, especially around UAVs and drones. Tell us how you came to this mission. Like, what's the story of why this mission of all the others that were in front of you?
Yeah, I mean, as I look back to my background, like again, a lot of my background's in unmanned systems, UAVs, things like that. But, I've kind of seen a lot of the different parts of the sensing world, right? I've been early stage at drone autonomy companies. I've worked on military unmanned systems that do, high altitude collection of information. I've obviously worked, through my time at Airbus, like building out technologies that better harnessed information in the space domain. And kind of what I learned, right, over all these years and all these customers that were using this content was one modality never solves most of these problems, right? Some of the problems can be solved by a satellite image. That can be solved by a drone ISR feed. they can be solved by a tweet that someone posted a video online at the perfect time and perfect place. And what I never really saw was this kind of holistic, like multi-int approach to all problems. And I think from what I've seen, this is where a lot of at least defense analysis, and even in the commercial world, they call it very different things, but everything is multi-int these days. And a lot of the systems and a lot of the industry capabilities are not designed that way. So we really wanted to focus on how could we bring together this kind of multi-int approach. And that's kind of been my background as well, right? So just seeing the sensing modalities, deploying these technologies with customers, seeing where they struggle because they're trying to take the piece of, say, what I was bringing formerly as coming from a satellite imagery company, but then trying to piece that together with different software tools, different analyses, different technologies they're using to get to some answer or to solve some workflow problem. That's kind of how my background's kind of helped lead us to here. It's just seeing so many customers trip up or just not be able to get all the way to what they needed across all these different ends.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you one other thing about your background, which is, you think about the types of founders in this defense tech environment, and some are transitioning service members or folks who have worked in government in some way or coming out to solve the problems that they experienced. Some are total outsiders who have caught the bug for the mission or responded to a Y Combinator call for a startup and are like coming in to just kind of shake things up. And then you're in this third bucket of you've actually been in the industry for quite some time. You've worked at the large established players and you're deciding like, okay, the way that I'm going to bring about this change is not by working within, it's by starting anew. I'm curious what your background, the fact that you've worked with these companies, how that informs the approach that you all are taking to the market. I think about early kind of 2018, 2019, when there was a lot of like the screw the primes, right? They're the enemy. We got to disrupt them. And now I think you're starting to see more partnerships with the prime. There's folks who actually recognize, like, actually, we're not going to totally displace Lockheed Martin. Like, maybe we should work with them. I'm kind of curious where you're at on that spectrum, Jesse, and how your background has informed that approach.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked in some of the large primes. Like for example, like my time at Booz Allen taught me a lot about how a lot of these acquisition processes work, how the customers operate. I was a younger engineer coming out of aerospace school, and trying to help the FAA build regulations around drones, or helping the Air Force with acquisition strategy around high altitude reconnaissance aircraft and things like that. And I obviously also being at a Silicon Valley startup after that, there's definitely a lot of that mentality sometimes of, hey, we can always do it better. But I think maybe that works in B2B SaaS. But, when you're talking about changing acquisition processes, how contract vehicles work, how people get money on contract, a lot of those same mentalities don't apply. And I think that the primes, the organizations like Booz Allen have enormous volumes of, highly skilled, really, really talented people that understand what these problems are. They're embedded and sitting with the customers every day. It's typically a really bad strategy for someone to come in and say, yeah, I know better than all of these people. They may be coming with a very different technological approach, but that's usually very complementary to what a lot of these people are doing. So, if you think about in the, and say in the geospatial space, you have like companies like a Maxar, for example, where there's so many different imagery companies and people think, well, I can always get the better picture. But a lot of times it's not about that. It's how do you integrate that into the right systems? How do you enable the right workflows and processes? And a lot of these organizations, they have the customer's trust. They have the contract vehicles. Their systems are embedded in a lot of these different workflows. So for technology companies, it typically is an enabler and a huge benefit to actually work with a lot of these organizations so that you get closer to that customer need, closer to that customer's inner workflow. There's obviously huge benefits, and it's kind of startup 101 to be as close to your customer as possible. And so you definitely do that as well. But when you think about it from a how do you get to scale perspective, my typical view is that you got to work hand in hand with the people that have been doing it for decades if you really want to scale. And we're even seeing that with like the larger companies like your Andurils and things like that, where they're embracing some of that. They're definitely going head to head with a lot of these bigger primes, but in other areas, they tend to partner because there's always something that can be complementary as well.
It's a super important point. That's the one that people usually come back to is that it's who owns the customer relationship, and do you have to go through an intermediary to talk to your customer? I'm curious, like, how have you guys structured these arrangements and what does it look like in practice?
So for example, just to be really clear, like there's very big differences between large data systems and hardware acquisition, right? So like a lot of times hardware acquisition, like you can build the thing that you're trying to deliver to the customer, get it in their hands, and you can go direct. Maybe that there's a very clear path to go do that. For a lot of the data and software infrastructure, a lot of times the customers will already have something in place. They'll have some common operating picture. They'll have, watch floors with analysts looking at information. And it's really difficult to just walk in there and say, here's a brand new thing. You're going to switch everything to this brand new thing. And so, we definitely now partner with a lot of, some of the primes that own a lot of those, large data infrastructure programs at a lot of these customers where one, we may start off as a, separate capability that's on the side of whatever their primary system is. But then we think about, okay, well, how do we provide APIs so that the analysts don't have to switch between different screens? How do we embed ourselves in the core workflow where, depending on the analyst and what they're trying to do, maybe they can use our product end to end to complete a full workflow, or maybe we're just something like a supercharged fast search at the front part of their workflow, but that they're using us as part of a much broader suite of software. And so that's where we have to think about, like, how do we leverage these partnerships to get to the end goal of how do we help the end user go from where they are today to a new state of work that they're able to do their job much faster, much more efficiently. And yes, sometimes that's using our product end to end, and sometimes that's using us as an API into a number of different systems. And that's just, the nature of the game, and how software is really different, I think, than hardware.
Well, software different than hardware, but also your approach is, I would say, flexible, right? It sounds like we can help in a number of different ways. The thing that matters is the workflow, the end user's experience. What I haven't heard you say is Danti needs to own the entirety of that workflow for us to be successful as a company. What is the aspiration for the company?
It's really hard to say, like, because, from a workflow perspective, right? Like it's hard to say that we want to be all things to all people. And I think that usually is a recipe for disaster, because we know we can't possibly be all things to all people. And I think it really depends on the persona. I think for us, we would love to be an end-to-end system for the vast majority of, not your highly skilled geospatial analyst, signals analyst, OSINT analyst, but your, deployed service member in the field, someone that doesn't have time to reach back and go through all these different layers. Like, we can be a full end-to-end system where someone can plug into an edge data node where they get a huge dump of information from an IC agency or some defense analyst or something like that, where they can now go in, they can query that, they can step through highly complex, maritime workflows, variety of different types of workflows out there where they can now step through this on their own. The AI system can suggest, these are some steps you should take. These are the types of data you'll need. Here's where you can find it, synthesize it for them, and get them to end output fast. That's where we can be the full piece of the pie. But, for your highly skilled experts back at headquarters that have multiple tools, multiple workflows, like that's where we really think about, all right, well, how can we plug into that existing mix so that we can really add a ton of value in the areas where we can. But there's other things like, for example, like detailed exploitation tools. Like, that's not us. Like, we're not building like highly skilled or highly expert tools where people are going through and creating, extensive maps of locations and, creating like really detailed plans for, whatever the operation might be. But anyway, so like we know we can't be all things to all people, and we try to focus on where do we think we can close an entire workflow versus where are we a piece of a workflow, and try to play into the ecosystem that currently exists to enable that to that scale.
Yeah. So we're talking now right on the precipice. And by the time folks are listening to this, you will have officially launched the public sector business. I'm kind of curious about, given the experiences you've had over the last 2 years, exploring these different approaches, winning some work and starting to move the needle. What are you hoping to achieve with this launch right now? Why are you launching now? And what does that mean for the company?
Yeah, and launch is kind of interesting because like we've been operationally in service and being used by hundreds of different users across, many different government agencies for over a year now, right? The company's about 2 years old, and the first year we're obviously super heads down building. We definitely won some contracts early on with some IC agencies like the NGA, which we announced, and others that we haven't. But that second year was really all about, okay, the core technology and the core infrastructure works. Now, how do we scale this into a variety of different workflows so that, the user can go from beyond the core knowledge engine into a bunch of other use cases, right? Like how do you enable, TC-PED style workflows, INW workflows? How do you enable, course of action generation for a bunch of different types of use cases and personas where the system learns and gets better? And so anyway, that was kind of our second year. It's focused on like, all right, how do we close the loop on some of these workflows, adapting the core technology, making sure it works across a bunch of different personas. And then now, as we're entering our third year of operating, it's like, okay, well now how do we scale this out? Like what are the other problems or the unknown unknowns that we're not aware of? And I think, that's what we're doing. We've been pretty quiet as a company, and there's a ton of use cases. When we go and we meet a lot of new organizations, we're like, we didn't really think about that. Or we had no idea that this could be used in this way. And that's one of the most satisfying things for us as well, is like you see folks get into the software and do stuff and you're just like, wait, I had no idea that this could be used for this purpose. That's what we're hoping to really do, is to sort of start to engage with a lot of new organizations that are maybe outside of our direct network of folks that we know deeply. And we've been kind of going after some of these problems, and they've known us even before we started the company. What else is out there, right? Who else can we support? How do we get into other organizations that are in the civil agencies, other defense agencies that we're not, currently engaged with, other parts of the IC, even foreign partners, right? Like how can we support better between the US and its allies and information discoverability and sharing? And the purpose of the launch is really to get more visibility into like, where else can we be helpful? What are some other organizations that have the same needs, for example, as maybe some of the ones we're serving today, where we can extend the capabilities to help them as well?
Yeah, so the nuance is, this is not the launch of doing business with the government. Far from it. This is the launch of how we're talking about the business publicly for a variety of audiences. And I think it's an important distinction. Let's roll the tape back, Jesse, because this is the fun part of what we get to do here on Crossing the Valley. I want to take you back to the early days. Obviously, the analyst workflow, super important. Dual use, government only. How did you think about kind of the initial customer that you sought to acquire?
When we think back to like when we first started the company, our plan was to be a dual use business at the very start. And we were going to build this kind of core nucleus that could really support a lot of different use cases, irrelevant whether it was government or commercial. The user and the sort of use case we always thought about was that, I kind of mentioned it before, around this, bottleneck between the experts and the non-experts. And, how do you take all of this information, spatial or otherwise, that is tied to a physical place or a topic or something like that, and break it down into like, what are the key core pieces? Like, what is this information useful for? And so we try to sort of make that as generic as we possibly could without having to go too deep. But what actually ultimately happened was, like a month into the business, we ended up winning a contract with NGA, and through some challenges they put out, we got deep with them, and we got deep with a lot of the folks that supported that challenge. And we're like, whoa, there's a lot here. A lot more than we even, were originally thinking. And so we just went all in on defense because, as a tiny team of engineers, and we still are mostly just engineering and a pretty tiny team, you can only do so much. And so we sort of, I don't want to say forgot about the commercial market, but, we didn't want to dilute our efforts, and we wanted to like focus in really, really deep on like a core problem set or two only, and make sure that we could solve that end to end. And that's been the focus. And so we sort of took our eyes off of the commercial market, but sort of kept a lot of those folks that, I've worked with for many, many years very close to the company. And we treated a lot of our commercial partners as like product discovery, early on, to make sure that we didn't build just a government only product, but something that can be used in commercial, but without actually deploying it into those markets. And for example, like the exact same tools and technology today that an organization like the Space Force or the US Army is using to do synthesis for, foreign natural disasters, is the exact same tools and the exact same process that FEMA is also using. And that also there are several insurance companies also looking at, like, instead of locations of ports or air bases, their properties, instead of, some report that's generating analysis on a particular ship or port, it's property analytics, transaction values, risk data. The system treats it as exactly the same. It just populates a graph a different way, and it populates like a different meaning as to what context that data informs. And so that's how we kind of think about the kind of dual use aspect.
Yeah, I think starting commercial or to government is a common kind of question. You very often hear, oh, well, we wanted to hedge or we wanted to dilute or defray the long sales cycle. You all went straight for the government. Let's talk about that NGA challenge process because I'm always fascinated by kind of how people find different front doors and then what works for them. So, first off, tell us what is an NGA challenge and what was it? Was this like a CIBR pitch day? Was this something? Was it a DIU commercial solutions offering? What was the actual mechanism and what did it look like for you guys?
Sure, yeah. So it was interesting timing. Like we actually heard about it before we even started the company. Martise, my co-founder, and I were actually in totally different roles, full time doing something else, knowing that we're like, I think we're going to start this soon, but we were like still trying to figure out the timing. And we saw this challenge come out. Like this particular one, it was run by Ensign, which is kind of like part of the DIU umbrella, so the National Security Innovation Network, that does more earlier stage stuff. And they put out a challenge from the NGA called G Search, which is just sort of like a next gen, how do I search? In this case, it was mainly just imagery, but like, how do I search for imagery across different government and commercial data repositories as one, right? Which is, great, right? It makes sense to a lot of folks, but today, how they're typically doing it is it's kind of more monolithic, individual data lakes and repos or portals that go into one specific pot of information or pool of data, as opposed to doing it in a distributed manner. We're like, hey, this lines up pretty well, and it just so happened like we were like a week or two away from starting the company, so it was kind of crazy timing. Like we were leaving our jobs to go focus on this 100% full time right when this thing came out. The product barely existed. Like it was just like some cobbled together thing that we had as like a demo, but the vision of where we wanted to go was directly aligned with where a lot of that leadership at NGA wanted. And, this wasn't obviously our first discussion with them. Like I had spent probably a year talking to, people in government, especially at, the highest levels of organizations like NGA, including former directors, where I'm like, what is the biggest problem that some of your analysts face, or maybe some of the gripes that you get from people external to the agency? And, what I kept hearing over and over was discoverability, dissemination, like that is kind of core to their mission. But there's so many different entry points. And so that was one of the pieces of advice that I got from one of the former directors in Robert Cardillo. Like he was incredibly helpful in sort of framing the problems of like, if someone could go about it in these certain ways, it would be really beneficial. And I don't think that was really directly related to this G Search challenge, but anyway, it was crazy timing. As like, we're literally quitting, we're starting on this thing comes out. We don't even really have, a fully formed product at that point, but we end up winning that small challenge. And there was, a contract on the backside of that. And we started working with NGA within like a month or two. And, we essentially started building a lot of our core technology, and they've, this project, right? They really liked the direction we were taking it because it was directly in line with what they wanted. So, their guidance as we were building was invaluable, right? And we met several of our next round of customers through that first engagement as well, because they started pulling in people from the Army 18th Airborne Corps, from Space Force, from a variety of different government agencies, to sort of give us advice on hey, if this could do this or work like this, and this is my workflow, this is my mission challenge. We got so much of that early on that I feel like going through the startup process multiple times, that sort of product discovery or customer discovery information is invaluable, and it takes a long time to get. And we got it all at once, but it led to like, a furious pace of development trying to meet some of these timelines. When we first got this contract, we were 2 people and like a really small prototype. And, a few months in, we'd already scaled to, 12 people, and we had a fully working system within a few months that was letting people in natural language query vast swaths of imagery across NGA and commercial imagery databases. But then we started piping in all the other modalities, and that was above and beyond what they even wanted. So anyway, it was a crazy experience. I don't always recommend that to people starting a company, that 1 month in, while you're building your core nodes, that you execute on a really tight contract trying to deliver something. But I think at the end of the day, it actually helped us, because it helped us speed up what we were doing quite a lot.
So level with us. Was that, you said you were talking to NGA for a year before. Was this written because they knew Danti was coming, or did Danti just happen to get lucky and see this thing out there at the right place at the right time?
I don't think it was written for us because like the folks that were advising us weren't even in the agency anymore, right? And that's why they were able to sort of give us some guidance, right? So I think it was just a known core problem, right? It was just a known core problem. And
Problem whose time had come.
yeah. And so like, they're trying to see maybe there's something at the earlier stage out there, and they put out these challenges to sort of skim at the early stages to see, hey, maybe outside of the primes or maybe outside of, some of our existing vendors, like maybe there's something else. And so we kind of had like a very different approach, which was, yeah, imagery is fine, but you need lots and lots of other modalities, and it shouldn't just be distributed search on imagery. And how do you bring together imagery, analytic detections, news, open source information? It's all contextual. But that will, for example, if you're a person that cares about imagery, you can still use all these other modalities to drive relevance to the images that matter. Instead of knowing I need a Maxar 30 centimeter completely nadir shot of this lat long, maybe you actually care about, Russian ship movements in and out of a certain port. And that's your actual question. And maybe there are some other things that will sort of tip you towards, well, this is the actual content that you need without you needing to specify it, right? And so that's like a completely inverse way to how most analysts are finding the information today.
I was deliberately trying to be provocative there, and even if it was wired, we couldn't talk about it right now. But it is. I think, look, right place, right time. Problem whose time has come. It sounds like it was kind of the perfect intersection of what you all had seen in the market, or what you all had seen, what the customer knew they wanted, and then you were right there to kind of address that pain. And look, there's high variance, right? Some of these programs, it's one and done. A lot of these like SBIR phase 1 type of things, they never go anywhere. This sounds like it was a highly motivated customer that was ready to solve the actual problem. So take us through, you mentioned they started introducing the other people. When this initial challenge and there was a contract on the back end, what kind of contract was that? And then where did it go next when you all started to deliver? What happened?
Yeah, so the type of contract, it wasn't a SIB or anything like that. They had set aside some funding and were able to sort of bring in a prime contractor that was already executing in a similar domain. And they brought us on as a subcontractor to sort of execute against that. And where it led, well, it ended up leading to even our work with the U.S. Space Force, right? So TAC SRT at the U.S. Space Force was sort of an advisor and sort of part of that project, and got a look at kind of what we were doing. And so where it led to us supporting, and which was the whole point of that project, was how can discoverability and dissemination be done for a lot of the external partners outside of NGA? How do they interact with that information much more easily in new ways? So, for example, NGA was also testing out a new system called Noodle, which is the NGA's unclassified data lake, to support more unclassified data sharing across the DoD and U.S. allies and partners. So where it went was to a lot of those folks that were looking at those programs to get new information. And so it led to us kind of building that initial nucleus as we were kind of doing as a company, but then now scaling it into several of these other organizations that, we're looking at that project, and we're looking at NGA for new ways to discover and use the content and analysis they were generating. That's kind of even where it still stands today, where, again, think of like one core central node that you're really working on, but now that node expanding exponentially in different areas where people have their own flavor of information inside their own organization, but they're trying to tap into what the NGA has as well. And so that's kind of where it went. We've got other things now going where there's many other types of use cases within the same organization, like an NGA and even others, where we may start with data discovery and, dissemination and things like that. But, getting now into others where like, okay, you can now help me discover stuff super, super fast at a super high relevancy. That's saving me an enormous amount of time. But can you also connect and provide that same contextual awareness for my analysis flows? So for example, having an analyst, again, I mentioned maritime, but we support a ton of other use cases, but I'll just use maritime because it's something that came up recently in our program. But, I'm an analyst doing this research. I need to find essentially a needle in a stack of needles. How do I use other context clues around the modalities that I'm currently using every day to get to a really, really much smaller set of information that is way more highly likely to be relevant, and then run my analysis on that, speeding my analysis, reducing compute costs, and then even having a system that can recommend, like when you get out of this core analyst set, that can recommend, these are the models you should run. This is the sequence you should run them in. These are the types of data that match the needs of those models, and then be able to step through that all automatically. without needing, a human to move data into all these different repositories, which is what's taking a lot of time today. And so that's kind of where it went, right? We kind of went distributed across different orgs that had the same problem, but then we also went deeper into some of those orgs that said, hey, this is a really cool first step. Now, how do I take it to the next step?
And what did that manifest in terms of contracts? Like what you initial deal, and then was this like an ordering vehicle or individual point contracts? What was the backbone of enabling that work?
Each of these organizations that we went into would all typically contract us separately. We're working on some things now, which hopefully we can announce soon, but where we'll have like much more highly centralized contracts where certain agencies can make us available in a much broader way. But today, like each of these organizations are contracting us separately because they have their own unique flavor of like, I want to connect my own sources, I want to connect my own workflows and have my own tradecraft in it. That's different organization to organization, but some of the higher level workflows and like the higher level things around, data discovery, dissemination, monitoring, alerting, and, automated, analysis and workflows, those are all pretty consistent. There's just a lot of nuance in each organization and the data and analysis models and things like that they use. So that's kind of where things have progressed to.
Yeah. I mean, it's, I think, it's not atypical at all. And there's a lot of churn every time you have to do a new contract. And not churn, it's the wrong word. There's a lot of friction. It takes time. There's different contracting officers, have different risk tolerances, different proclivities, different preferences. So I imagine that's, one of those things where maybe one of the next steps for you guys is that vehicle.
I can share a little bit too about like, if the listeners here are thinking about like, how do I get a customer's need on contract quickly? Like some of the things that we've done, if helpful, like in the AI space, for example, there's organizations like CDAO. They provide something called the TradeWinds Marketplace, which essentially provides, if you go through their vetting process, they look at your software, they look at your use cases, they talk to your users, and they go through a lot of this to make sure that one, what you're doing meets a need, the technology is there, it's useful, it's legitimate, and then they'll essentially put their stamp of approval on it and make you awardable on their sort of broader OTA contracts. And so that's one avenue, right? So being able to leverage OTA contracts and be able to have that sort of like a central vetted node where you've gone through competition, it's been competed, it's there, it's available, you have a contract and contracting officers that can move quickly. But there's also for software companies, like there's organizations like we've partnered with Carasoft, for example. They're really well known in bringing software into the variety of different areas in the federal space, and now we have contract vehicles as well through our partnership with them, where they can also bring us and get us on contract with a number of customers. And then for folks out there that go through the SIBR track, we've gone through SIBRs as well, and those progress into, for example, in our path and the Air Force and Space Force, those have progressed through like the TAC-5 flow, and then you can get dollars on phase 3 contracts and things like that. So I think for an earlier stage company, it's good to have options, right? Depends on the agency, their contracting officers, what contracts they're used to and familiar with. And then also, we've also done a lot of work where we'll partner with a prime that is the existing prime on a current contract where, the customer has a need there. And then you can just come in as a sub to an existing task order. And so there's many ways to kind of go about it. And we've done all of them.
Yeah, I think optionality, especially as a small company, is essential.
Yeah.
So tell us, Jesse, and we'll start to look to the future, but in the year ahead, in the 12 months, we don't need to talk 5, 10 years, let's talk the next year. What's on tap for Danti? Like, what do you all most want to accomplish in the next 12 months?
We're all about scale now. It's how do we go from hundreds of users in an organization to thousands? How do we deploy on the actual customers' networks, right? And that we're going through those processes now, and ability to hold classified contracts and all that. But really, it's all about scale, right? How do we get from, a few $1 million in pilots and things like that in an organization to an actual scaled deployment where anyone in that organization can access it? We're doing a lot of also on the technology side. Some of what we've kind of released publicly looks a lot more just like your initial search and retrieval, but we've gone pretty deep in a lot of areas, like where we've already deployed pretty advanced, like indication and warning, like monitoring kind of systems where an AI system can look at hundreds or thousands of locations across many types of modalities and ints and do alerting and things like that. That's very cumbersome process. And I think one of the things we're most excited about is sort of what we call sort of more of like a knowledge mesh, and think more like course of action where we can connect up highly expert analysis systems, whether they be automated or otherwise. So think models or even human generated analysis, and be able to sort of encode domain specific tradecraft. And we've already kind of deployed this with a few customers where, in a variety of domains, based on the language that the person is using of any skill, being able to actually go through a very highly expert sequence of events to find information, pull the right type of information, pair it with analysis, and get through the entire workflow completely automated, where the human can just sort of oversee and make sure that the system is moving in the right direction. I think that's one of the most important things, or at least that we're super excited about doing, because it kind of, what I mentioned earlier, kind of our core vision, right? Like how do you help the person at the edge or the end user do things that today, are highly expert? And what this does, again, is this sort of alleviates the pressure on those experts in the government from having to field every single request, right? Where they can focus on the really, really difficult, high level stuff that really, really takes a lot of expertise and domain. So being able to sort of do that at large scale, I think that's what we're really excited about.
Yeah. What does your organization have to look like for that to be possible? I'm curious, what are the key roles you're thinking about hiring, or what does the team size have to be to support that future?
We're still a very small team. We're only about 20 people, almost all engineering. And so our plan is to be able to stay as small and nimble as we can and not have to grow to huge amounts. And we try to focus on scaling out that engineering, and we'll continue to scale engineering. But I think what's interesting now in the AI domain, and you see it in a lot of the consumer companies, is that people can scale, to pretty high numbers of impact and revenue without a ton of people, because a smaller number of people can do more with, AI, dev assist tools. And there's a lot of interesting stuff that you can do from the adaptation of existing models and things like that, where you're not like having to train and build your entire own, custom models for every use case. So we can do a lot with a small amount of people. I think we'll definitely need to get a lot bigger in the areas that, or somewhat bigger, but I think the areas that we're investing in are the areas where we just have to do it to be able to scale in the areas where we want. So think like in the security domain and being able to, deploy software, get it ATO, deploy on a variety of different security frameworks, things like that. So those are the areas where we're investing now. And, obviously the sales and marketing domain, things like that, we've been real small there, but those are some of the areas that we're definitely going to invest in here.
Jesse, as we move to close here, I'm curious for your maybe high level reflections of, as you think about kind of the landscape of companies. We've had a number of folks in kind of the open source or just the analyst kind of world on the program. We had Vanavar, we had Samit Baze, we Prashant at Accrete, and others who are all kind of looking to try to help anybody who intersects with this kind of explosion of data make sense of kind of the world in a more kind of seamless way. Where do you think we are in this transition? What's the next couple of years look like for the intelligence world and the analytic world writ large with respect to national security?
Yeah, I mean that's a big one. I think you mentioned some really interesting companies too, and I think it's going to take all of us, right? Because I've mentioned it before. Like I think any company or any organization that thinks they can do it all is going to find that a big challenge pretty quick. And I think it's going to take all of us to be able to kind of go after different parts of these workflows and different parts of these problems. And I think where it's going is it's going into more multi-INT, multi-domain for sure. And it's going into organizations that like can come together, where I'm seeing a lot more partnering happening, even with companies that may on paper sound competitive, but when you get down into the nuts and bolts of what they're actually doing, in many cases, it can be totally complementary. So what I've been seeing is more of this, multi-INT and also multi-company approach to a lot of problems, which I think is awesome. We're seeing it, right? We partner with a lot more even startups and larger companies and things like that. So we can go attack some problem with we can be a piece, and now these are the other 4 missing pieces, but together we can actually solve the entire problem end to end. And, I didn't see that a lot before. Like I saw a lot of, you talked earlier about the primes, a lot of organizations that are trying to bring the whole thing, and each company has their own competitive view of what the whole thing is, versus a more consortium approach of, well, let's think about it ahead of time and let's come together to the customer with, these are all the different pieces that will come bring that multi-source view that will sort of address the problem. And so I think that's really encouraging to see a lot more companies doing that. But yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Awesome, Jesse. Well, hey, look, we're grateful to you for taking some time to talk with us. Let's leave it with this. If folks are interested in learning more about Danti, or maybe they want to join the mission and be a part of this growing team, how do they learn more?
Yeah, I mean, you can visit us, obviously, website, Danti, DANTI.ai. There, we've also got jobs posted. Feel free to email us, reach out directly. All that information's there on the website. We're always hiring and looking for great candidates, and always, trying to work with different folks in different parts of the government.
Awesome. All right. Well, hey, best of luck to you. We'll be watching, we'll be rooting for you. And thanks for joining us.
I'm good. Thanks for having me.